Hello, and welcome to the Aequalia YouTube channel. My name is Aequus Nox, and today's episode is exciting because I've invited Brian Johnson here to explore the intersection of love, magic, myth, and ritual. Which leads me to the question, what exactly is love? And what happens when we turn to occult practices in its pursuit? For love, in all its complexity, is a mysterious and core part of the human experience. It is a thread throughout the ages, both as the light that inspires our art and the shadow that brings us pain. Brian's expertise in anthropology, history, and the study of grimoires and magic texts like the papyri make him uniquely qualified to discuss these topics. This exploration began with an unseriously serious question that I asked Brian about Cupid's appearance in CLM 849 during our first interview. His answer sparked a desire to dive deeper, and so today we will be examining love's influence on our magic and traditions. Thank you so much for listening, and if you enjoy this discussion and want to learn more, be sure to check out our previous interview on my Patreon. Now, let's dive into my conversation with Brian. So, without further ado, Brian, thank you so much for joining me today. For our listeners who might be unfamiliar with you or your work, could you tell us about your background and how you came to write Necromancy in the Medici Library for Hadean Press?
Hi, and thanks for having me back.
I'm excited you're back.
Thank you. Among several other jobs, but probably most relevant to this conversation, I translate and write about historical books of magic and related topics. This began as something I did out of just personal research interest, but as it turns out, quite a few other people thought it was interesting too. So I've been able to get several of these works published over the years, mostly through Hadean Press. Necromancy in the Medici Library is the title that I gave to my partial edition and translation of manuscript Pluteus 8938 of the Biblioteca Medicaea Lorenziana in Florence, Italy, which is a huge compilation of magic spells, demonological lore, and things of that nature. My translation focused on a small number of operations in the book, which, for reasons I think we'll mention later, appear to be historically related to one another outside of that manuscript, and a number of which I believe also touch upon the theme of this episode.
That was definitely part of the inspiration for today's episode. And for anybody who hasn't already picked up any of Brian's work, they are phenomenal. They are worth every single penny, not just Necromancy in the Medici Library, but he's got a really great pamphlet out. And I just think it's really good to have that context for people who are interested. So what was it that initially drew you to the study of magic, particularly within the context of the papyri and the grimoire traditions?
So I've always had an interest in trying to understand just the diversity of human culture and belief. And I don't mean just religious or spiritual beliefs, although I think those are often the most interesting because they're the hardest to explain. And part of that has been tracing and learning to distinguish between parallels and continuities among cultures that are widely separated in time or space. And in the case of texts like the Magical Papyri and just magical texts in general, I think they give us both an insight into the culture of the time and place in which they were produced, cutting across categories of material prosperity, medicine, sexuality, and most other concerns of everyday life, along with religion and ideas about how the cosmos functions, but also providing a kind of, I would call it a fossil from which we can look for parallels and connections in other times and places, and maybe try to work out if these are signs of continuous genealogical transmission and how that may have come about, or just a case of, convergent evolution and the fundamentals of human nature.
I actually think that I find the same interest. I really love to look at the continuity between two different points in time, particularly because of today's topic, obviously, magic and myth. But I just love to see what kind of survives and what and how it transforms.
Mhm.
So, in a conversation that we had beforehand, you mentioned listening to the SHWEP podcast with Svenja Nagel on Egyptian erotic magic. And so you sent me the link and I took a listen. And it was fantastic, by the way. So I'm going to link that below for anybody who wants to follow up. But were there particular aspects of this discussion that like resonated with you? And are there any points that you would expand on or like offer a different perspective?
Yeah, one point in particular that Professor Nagel made, which I think has implications worth bearing in mind when we talk about any particular like class or type of magic, is that generally it's going to be something of an artificial frame of reference that really cuts across a number of different operational perspectives. So when we think of what like erotic magic entails, for example, we come up with really a spectrum of activities ranging from various sorts of self-improvement or empowerment to make oneself more attractive to others, on one hand, over to coercing their attention via what amounts to psychophysical torture on the other, with a lot of gradations in between. And this is just as true for the spells we have from late antique Egypt as it is for popular books of, occult secrets being published in the early 20th century.
I think that's a really great thing to keep in mind when you're studying or even practicing with these texts. So I know that there's definitely interest in both. But we're in the future, so we have access to a lot more than we ever have before. So focusing on the Greek and Demotic magical papyri, can you describe the types of erotic magic spells found within these texts? And like, what are the desired goals of these spells beyond simple attraction? So is it like fidelity, control, arousing desire? What are the spells about?
Yeah, erotic magic forms probably one of the single largest categories of spells among the papyri. I counted just under 70 entries that are explicitly defined as erotic or love spells in Hans Dieter Betz's edition of the translated Magical Papyri corpus. And there are many others that, for all intents and purposes, should be in that same category. So keep in mind that my comments on all of this should not be taken as a systematic analysis. But that said, most of the spells fall somewhere on a continuum between outright coercion. For example, there's an erotic binding spell. It's PGM4, beginning at line 296, for the purpose of making a target person, quote, remember no one but me, and so on. And it involves piercing a clay effigy of the person with copper needles in order to subdue her faculties and free will. And on the other hand, there are operations intended to simply create a very strong desire in a person, such as what's called the Sword of Dardanos spell, which uses
Mhm.
much less aggressive language of simply, as it says, turning the soul of so and so towards the practitioner. I do think it can be difficult to precisely place many of the spells on that continuum, simply because the language of magical invocations tends to be both formulaic and poetic in this kind of the same way that a liturgical text would be. So the precise intentions of the individual magician are often left somewhat opaque, and it can be ambiguous whether a spell is actually meant to be torturing someone into submission or just a very forceful description of inciting lust. Uh, and then finally, there are a number of spells, and I kind of put air quotes around spells here, that they appear primarily among the Demotic Egyptian text rather than the Greek, and they're really just pharmaceutical prescriptions. Some say things like to cause a woman to love her husband, but others will simply say, quote, to make a woman love copulating with you. And in any case, the directions for their use makes the function of these mostly uh, preparations of various herbal substances. It makes their function pretty unmistakable.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And I love seeing the contrast between, things that we do today, even in modern medicine and in life, but how they still reflect back and they kind of look the same. So I've heard always that a large portion of the magic in the papyri is love magic. So that was validating to hear somebody else find the same thing because just kind of goes to show how important it is to people and how it impacts us. So, what gods and goddesses are most frequently invoked in these erotic spells, and how do their mythological roles inform their use in these magical practices?
Well, there are some of the obvious ones like Eros and Aphrodite. They show up, of course. But what's interesting is it's not nearly as frequently as you might imagine for love spells. Um, Isis appears in a framing narrative slash historiola to one spell that it alludes to her marriage to Osiris, but within this story, her sister Nephthys has seduced him. Now, this is not the most widely transmitted version of their myth, although I did actually find that it parallels the account given in the early second century by Plutarch in his essay on Isis and Osiris in the Moralia. So somebody was talking about it, and in this case, I would suppose it was chosen to parallel the situation of the prospective user of this spell. Um, Now, the chthonic deities, the underworld deities, who were actually invoked for various more or less aggressive purposes all throughout late antique magic, actually seem to have been some of the most popular choices in this category. Just for example, Persephone, the Sumerian goddess Ereshkigal, Hermes Thoth in his chthonic aspect as a psychopomp, and also Anubis are all invoked in a single spell of this type. That's PGM 4296. And likewise, the spirits of the dead themselves are called upon, along with Hecate, Persephone, and the Moirai in another spell. Uh, and that one is interesting in that whereas the ghosts are called upon to help out the magician because he has brought them a food sacrifice as part of the ritual, the gods here are specifically invoked in their capacity as judges, because the target of the spell, it says, is alleged to have quote been ungodly and unholy, and I think this is probably only in the opinion of the magician, who is most likely their rejected suitor. There's another example of basically the same model in PGM 42441, which again appeals to Ereshkigal, this time accusing the targeted woman of blasphemy against that goddess. And I I have to say, I feel like these last two spells in particular really draw a distasteful but probably accurate picture of the kind of petty and frankly kind of pathetic person who would have used them. I mean, this is essentially like using the gods of the underworld to swat someone who wouldn't pay attention to you. But in any case, there are many other gods named in the papyri, love spells and otherwise. But I think broadly speaking, the idea generally is that the deity being invoked is acting in a role that does befit their mythological depiction, even if that role does not directly have any bearing on love or romance.
Yeah, I think that that's actually really important to point out and puts perspective on just not even the love spells, but just any of the spells in general in the papyri when you're looking at the gods or the goddesses being invoked, and like kind of go back and compare that to their myths and then try to understand, well, why was the magician putting these in this place? And so, I would expect more like Eros or something, or Aphrodite. But I'm actually really excited and relieved to hear that there's definitely a certain amount of necromancy and working with chthonic deities that doesn't really, come across at first sight. So, one question that I have for you, this one's really exciting for me because I have recently become pretty interested in ethnobotany. So I want to discuss the role of plant materials in these spells and how they were typically used. So, are they applied to the body, used in incantations, offered as sacrifices? I know we kind of touched on this earlier, but like, what are people doing with the plants?
Right. All of the above, basically. The actual like potentially physiological effects of any of these plants is absolutely not my area of expertise, so I couldn't really comment on it. But as far as the how the substances are employed in the spell directions, at least, um, plant and animal materia are they're burned as offerings. They're applied topically, sometimes ingested. In several cases, I found it interesting that an animal, so one example is a scarab, and in another case, a mouse, is basically verbally identified with a god or otherwise divinized in some way through the course of the ritual before being sacrificed and used in one of the aforementioned manners. Um, and also other substances, just like incense, are sometimes in the same way empowered as kind of an active agent of the operator's will through a kind of verbal personification in the spell.
I think that that's also a really important call out because you often see like do such and such with this animal and like deify it.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's always just like an interesting observation, and I think it's important for those who are interested in sympathetic magic to kind of obviously, do your research before you do anything, but I just think it's interesting to see the use of plants and animals and other materials that are natural for the use of spells. Um, so, how do these ancient texts reflect the diversity of sexual and gender expressions? Because is it possible that we have spells that are intended for same-sex relationships or relationships that are beyond the traditional male and female binary?
Yeah, and this actually brings up another point that Professor Nagel made in that podcast interview, which is not immediately apparent if you're just reading the published editions of the papyri, because most of these are actually they're prescriptive texts. They're basically templates for professional magicians to modify as necessary for particular clients. And are usually written with the kind of a default assumption that they'll be used by men upon women, although there are exceptions. But when we look at archaeologically recovered magical inscriptions, by which I mean texts which themselves formed part of a spell, not just instructions for doing one, we actually do find all of the possible gender combinations of operator and target person being represented, at least to some extent.
I found that point to be really interesting when I first heard it, and I thought that it would be relevant just as context because of the interest that people have in the papyri and like just overall magical practices. Yes, it is often men, but women participate in it too. But another thing that I think that is really interesting is that these are templates. And so I think sometimes we look at a spell and we just like assume that this is the way it is and that it can't be modified. And so that modification was done back then, and we still do it with not even just papyri texts, but grimoires. So yeah, so I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit here because I want to explore some mythology. So the myth of Eros and Psyche is an interesting one and is a pretty prominent theme in Western culture. So how is this myth reflected in some of the erotic magic spells in the papyri? And are there any specific ones that draw upon this myth? Because I did bring up academic paper that I read when we spoke before the interview by Eleni Pachoumi, and she has an article called Eros and Psyche in Erotic Magic. So I wanted to get your thoughts on her analysis of the myth, but then also how do you think that these themes continue to influence the practice of erotic magic beyond the period of the papyri?
Give some background. In her article, Pachoumi argues that the representation of Eros, the god, not the concept, in the Sword of Dardanos spell, which is PGM4, beginning at line 1716, that it draws directly upon the allegory of Cupid and Psyche, taken from Apuleius's second century novel, The Metamorphoses, also often titled the Golden Ass. And hence, indirectly, that it evokes the Platonic concept of the soul returning to its proper place in the cosmos through the operation of erotic attraction. Apuleius was well known as a Platonist philosopher, which is more explicitly apparent in his nonfiction writing. But all of this comes from, more or less, from Plato's Symposium, which I won't go into all the details of here, but essentially, it seems that this spell in the papyri is basically appropriating the philosophical concepts, on the one hand, of the reunion of primordially united souls, and on the other hand, of the union of the individual soul with a kind of eternal abstract beauty or good. And then applying these ideas in something almost like a historiola, a kind of magically sympathetic speech act, to direct Eros, again, the god, not the Platonic concept, to unite the soul of the spell's target with that of the magician. Now, I'm not aware of any instances where this particular philosophical underpinning is explicitly apparent in later grimoire magic specifically. But it is true that when the Platonic discourse about Eros, in Eros the concept, was rediscovered in more or less in the Latin West during the Renaissance, mostly thanks to Marsilio Ficino's translating and writing commentaries on those original Greek texts. The idea of the power of beauty over a person's soul or psyche, along with the role of Eros in the soul's search for some missing piece of itself, did become very influential in medicine and psychology, which are both fields to which magic is frequently applied. Just to make a brief digression to give some context, Renaissance medical theory held that the soul, which is what contains what we would call our active mental faculties, receives images of the outside world reaching our sense organs via the intermediary of our spirit, which is thought of as a vaporous substance that is somewhere between soul and matter, and so it can interact with both. Mm. So when the image of a beautiful person enters the soul, when we fall in love, the soul of the person perceiving this is drawn toward and comes to identify itself with this other person. And it actually becomes kind of alienated from its own body and spirit and independent existence. Now, if the beloved reciprocates this love, and each of these two individuals is allowed to possess the other person in whom their own being has kind of come to reside, then the process culminates happily in something like the character Aristophanes' speech in Plato's Symposium, with the two souls essentially reunited in one being. But if not, then the lover experiences a kind of melancholic love sickness that more or less amounts to losing his soul. Uh, Beyond the realm of romance specifically, this kind of interrelation of images and spirit and psyche, kind of all tied together and attracted to one another by this universal erotic force, uh, also had implications for Renaissance magical theory. Marsilio Ficino wrote about how manipulating certain stimuli, or what we might think of as magical materia, sounds, colors, stones, and plants, that have particular abstract qualities, allows one to attract the cosmic forces that correspond to those qualities, which he usually thought of in terms of the powers of the classical planets, but it would also theoretically apply to other spiritual beings. And this kind of operates through the contiguity of the spirit of the world, the anima mundi, with the individual spirits of the creatures who exist within it. And about a century after Ficino, Giordano Bruno also speculated about individual and collective psychological manipulation based on the same theory of erotic sympathies, and how a magician might be able to indirectly exercise control over a person by arousing desire or other passions in their soul by introducing the correct images into their imagination. And to be clear, when I say images, it would be probably more accurate to think of these like something like memories with a kind of emotional content attached to them, not just like static pictures. Um, and finally, I would speculate that, and also there's evidence for this in Agrippa's first book in chapter 50, that these same Renaissance theories kind of informed, or I think probably more likely were just used to provide kind of a post hoc explanation for the efficacy of things like the evil eye, or why certain forms of malefic spell work prescribe face-to-face contact with the victim. Uh, Basically, that an individual might be able, by sheer will, to convey these images from their own imagination through the spiritual vapor flowing out of their eyes, into the imagination, and into the soul of the person they're making eye contact with.
I always found the Sword of Dardanos to be one of the most interesting and unique spells of the papyri, specifically in that context of, love and erotic magic. And so when I read that article and kind of had a different perspective offered to me, I wanted to, see what other people observed, and, how far did we take that? So even though it doesn't particularly show up in the grimoires, I think it's good to know that it still kind of found some inspiration in the Renaissance era. And yeah, I think the biggest thing that surprised me by your answer is actually when you brought up the evil eye, because understanding that concept is has always been kind of an interesting, tricky thing for me. So I never thought about it that way. So, like, how does the concept of envy or a malevolent gaze factor into the practice of magic?
I found some evidence of this in Agrippa's occult philosophy, and he actually does connect the this principle to what he calls erotic enchantment. And I can actually paraphrase what he says in chapter 50 there, and this is from Eric Perdue's translation of the book. He says, "Men are most bewitched when a repeated sharp stare from an eye meets a direct sharp gaze from the other eye. When this happens, rays are joined with rays, spirit is joined with spirit. Thus strongly bound, the sharp rays of the eyes or a certain sudden gaze kindle strong loves. Then, with the spirit and amorous blood injured, the passions aroused in this gaze are carried by the lover and bewitcher and no other." But again, I suspect that this is probably more of a kind of learned rationalization of what was already a widespread folk belief in things like the evil eye, which I've read anthropologists who have studied this topic, and it seems to have more to do with people's kind of subjective experience of envy and paranoia in small insular communities under especially in the medieval period and earlier under persistent survival stress, really.
I look forward to following up in Purdue's Agrippa. I have it. It's huge. So thank you for giving us all of the, details of where to find it. And I am going to be putting all of that in a post after this. This is an interesting one because it kind of brings us back to Necromancy in the Medici Library and our previous interview. Because I asked you about Cupid before. So I wanted to know if we can trace the evolution of Eros, like directly to Cupid, and how did this transition in mythology impact the understanding or practice of love magic, if at all?
Yeah, so okay, Eros and Cupid, and this is I know putting it overly simplistically, are two gods embodying the same aggregate of concepts portrayed by two different cultures, the Greeks and the Romans. Like many Greek deities, by the time of the Roman imperial period, the Romans had largely identified the two with one another. Although Cupid seems not to have received the same degree of independent cult worship as his Greek analog, and often appeared more as just kind of a metaphorical personification in works of art than as an object of veneration. Although some of the philosophical schools in the Roman period, which were, of course, influenced by Plato's writings, did adopt Cupid slash Eros as a kind of cosmic binding principle, which actually seems to be an idea that was carried over from Hesiod and some of the pre-Socratic philosophers, where Eros was one of the first gods to come into existence. Uh, Insofar as the figure of Eros Cupid appears in ancient love magic, and again, to my knowledge, the Sword of Dardanos is virtually the only really explicit instance we have, at least the only complete one. There is a fragmentary spell in the papyri that it probably also has an erotic purpose, although it's not exactly clear. But there are also some number of carved gemstones from antiquity that also depict the god Eros burning Psyche with a torch, which is another image that we see in the text of the Sword of Dardanos spell. Um, and these gems almost certainly had a similar magical function as well. Um, all of these instances do seem to draw directly upon this same narrative that kind of originates in Apuleius's novel, and hence, I think even if they were not explicitly aware of it, the people who composed these spells were all drawing upon Plato's concept of this universal erotic force that kind of binds people and really everything together.
One thing that I really thought was interesting, because I know that, with Sword of Dardanos being the only spell that we really have with Eros, I love the call out of the fact that we do have some stones that have the same Eros and Psyche. I've found those before, so I'll include those as well, but they do match the spell. So whether they were used together or there was more, I thought that was really fascinating, and just kind of, the relationship between Eros and Cupid, because because I brought up the spell in CLM 849. So I guess that brings me to a question I asked you previously, but how did Cupid become a figure in the Grimoire tradition later, and what role does he play?
Yeah, Cupid's appearances in the Grimoires, it is fairly limited, but it's interesting because it seems to be the result of the kind of dissemination and copying of a single text into this relatively small number of manuscripts, which largely due just to historical coincidence have been the ones that were preserved and rediscovered in modern times. Uh, as you mentioned, there is a spell in manuscript CLM 849, the so-called Munich Necromancers Handbook, for acquiring the love of a woman using a combination of sympathetic image magic and demonic conjuration. And one of the demons named in this operation is Cupido. Now, this may be an instance of a pagan deity being transposed into a demon by a Renaissance magician with a little bit of classical education. It could also simply be a nominalization of a Latin adjective, cupidus, in the sense of passionate or lecherous, and just more or less a description of this demon being used as a name. But in any case, he's not really given much personality in the spell. Along with the other spirits named there, he's simply commanded to incite passion in a particular part of the woman's body and to induce her to seek out the magician in order to satisfy it. But what I think is the really interesting thing about the spell, because, let's be honest, the content is not terribly unique. Uh, it's interesting that it exists in 4 separate copies that we know of. All, as I say, all clearly derived from the same original text, notwithstanding that one is only a fragment. And these are scattered all across Europe and North Africa, and all appear to date to sometime in the 15th century. Besides CLM 849, they appear in the already mentioned Pluteus 8938, which I note in my introduction to necromancy in the Medici Library. These two manuscripts share a significant number of spell texts, which are in the Medici manuscript, all kind of collected in one part of the manuscript. So it seems to me at least that the person who the person who compiled CLM 849 and the person who compiled the Pluteus 8938 manuscript probably both had access to some parent manuscript that collated all of these spells in one place to begin with. But back to the spell we're talking about. There is a fragmentary Hebrew manuscript from the Cairo Geniza, which was studied by Ortal Paz Sar in an article where she has determined on linguistic and ritual grounds, specifically that the names of the spirits and also the fact that the spell involves biting a dove's heart out kind of indicate that this is not natively Jewish magic, and was most likely a Hebrew translation of what was originally a Latin spell. And then finally, and I have to give credit here to Simone Baldacci for pointing this out in a blog post of his. The spell also is included in Bibliothèque Nationale de France manuscript 1524, which is an Italian manuscript, which, in addition to an early version of the Key of Solomon, contains a number of other spells and experiments like this one. And finally, given the narrow chronology of these manuscript texts, like I said, they all appear to come from the 15th century. I would be inclined to guess that this spell might have been an original invention of the late 14th or early 15th century, most likely somewhere in Italy, from where it could pretty easily have traveled around the Mediterranean and crossed over the Alps. So I think we could be looking at an original composition from kind of from within the clerical necromantic underground. Maybe produced by a lonely monk or one just looking to make some money off of lonely lay people.
Wow. So that is so much to unpack. I really look forward to doing some follow-up research on that because you make some really interesting observations, not only about, the manuscripts that we have that are similar, where they come from, and, how they potentially got there, but also really important to underline that the clerical necromantic underground has become a really, interesting area for Grimoire magicians and scholars to kind of study and talk about these days. So I love that call out. But as a side note, shout out to Simone, who has an amazing blog, which I will link below because I always see them in online spaces like such as Facebook and Discord servers. So really helpful for the community. So yeah, switching to something that's really interesting on the topic of Cupid, because I always found this to be so interesting, and that's why I asked you in our first interview, because my idea of Cupid has always been, the little cherub with the bow and the arrow and the hearts and like what we do for Valentine's Day. So it's kind of interesting to see how that has evolved over time. So can you kind of explain how Cupid became associated with Valentine's Day, and how did this holiday evolve, or like what role did cultural and religious factors play in this transformation?
Yeah, it's interesting because originally Valentine's Day was just the feast day of Saint Valentine of Rome, who was martyred there in the third century. There for a long time there have been suggestions that the holiday's association with love is somehow due to it sharing an approximate date with the Roman festival of Lupercalia, but Lupercalia was really more of a public purification and fertility rite. It didn't really have much bearing on individual romance or even sexual relationships. Valentine's Day appears to have first become associated with love and romance in the way we think about it in the 14th century with Chaucer's narrative, The Parliament of Fowls, where he identifies it as the day that all of the birds choose their mates. Although there's actually evidence that he had in mind a different Saint Valentine, it was Valentine of Genoa, whose feast day is in May, which might make more sense in the context of birds mating. But anyway, the association with love seems to have taken off from there. Because already in the 15th century, we have evidence of people on both sides of the English Channel writing, pretty sappy love poems where they're actually calling each other their Valentine. Um, and by that time, the character of Cupid had already, as I mentioned earlier, been a kind of artistic metaphor for love for almost 2,000 years, and the uh, the rediscovery of classical culture in the Italian Renaissance meant that Cupid or the other what are called erotes, the little winged guys who follow Aphrodite around, and became the modern cherub, more or less, had begun appearing in things like paintings and sculptures that rich aristocrats had commissioned for public display in their, gardens and halls, which made this image of the winged youth with a bow a familiar element of most levels of society's kind of visual vocabulary.
Yeah, that's definitely, I think, how I, recognized it. But I really think it's interesting that we have other celebrations, such as Lupercalia, which is evidently not that similar. And also the birds mating. That's a really unique observation. I didn't even have that perception before. This brings me to my next question, since we're kind of talking about the contrast between, where Valentine's Day started, and the modern celebration of Valentine's Day. So, is the idea of true love depicted in ancient myths still overly commercialized and sentimentalized, or are we kind of like detached from the way they used to look at it?
Well, I think I'll set aside the question of what the true nature of love is, because I really don't think I'm qualified to answer that. But maybe we should really ask, if do we want to celebrate love the way it was usually portrayed in the ancient myths? I mean, more often than not, these are stories about hapless women being manipulated by the gods, or men being uh, torn to shreds by Diana's hounds when he accidentally catches her naked. Um, Although I think this actually does make them pretty accurate models of a lot of erotic magic. It might not make them the best for healthy human relationships. Um, as to the other question, yes, I mean I think it's pretty obvious Valentine's Day has been kind of hollowed out and commercially exploited, just like every other holiday or product of human culture. It's just what capitalism does. But that also means it's completely public property now. It's been emptied of any kind of sacred numinosity that might keep it off limits. So we're free to interpret and celebrate it or not, however we want to.
I love that. I think it's really on point, and I really just feel like Valentine's Day sets up a certain expectation for a lot of people, and so yeah, redefining what that means to us, what love and myth and magic mean to us, is important. And since it is hollowed out, we should just celebrate it how it means to us, rather than feel like we have to celebrate how Valentine's Day currently is, you know? So, kind of shifting gears again, because I want to go back to love as like a theme in magical traditions, especially across different like historical periods. So does it appear that it's like simply a matter of human desire, or are there ever like deeper spiritual or psychological factors that are at play when people are practicing this?
Well, I mean, again, I feel like I'm being too uncharitable, but I really don't think there was much more to it than the basic physical and psychological impulses that our species has had to deal with for literally hundreds of thousands of years at this point. Uh, you know, we've always dressed it up in ideas of romance or, even like Plato's predestined soulmates. But I think at the root, it's just our genes telling us to make more copies of ourselves and, to keep the other guy from getting there to do it first. Uh, but in any case, I don't think there's much in the ancient magical literature that really presents a strong counter argument to that. Um, and I don't mean this as any kind of a value judgment, really. It's these drives are what human civilization has been built on. Uh, but I do think it's probably healthier if we recognize them and don't pretend that they are something else.
I definitely agree. And I always found like the concept of predestined soulmates to be like compelling, but they kind of fall flat when you compare it to actual human nature. And I think it's just really important to kind of reevaluate the way we look at these things, especially now. So yeah. Um, how do the approaches of love magic in grimoires differ from those found in the papyri? Are they significant in emphasis shifts or technique, or are they kind of the same and we just never change?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot like the desires they're intended to satisfy. The methods of love spells did not really change a great deal between antiquity and, say, the early modern period, let alone today. Um, just like the spells in CL 849, which is from the 15th century, Paul Foreman's book of ritual magic from 16th century England has spells sending spirits to cause women distress until they submit to the magician, which is functionally not really any different from the way that various gods or ghosts are employed in the magical papyri and some 2,000 years before that. Likewise, in some of the charm compilations from 19th century Sweden, what are called the Svartkonstböcker, um, we find the same kinds of sympathetic magic to metaphorically inflame someone by literally heating up a little bit of their blood or hair, which is we find in the papyri as well. And many spells combine this kind of sympathetic magic with demonic magic. Like there's another love spell from CL 849, as well as the Medici Codex, which makes use of a wax effigy of a person in much the same way as the copper pins spell from the papyri that I mentioned earlier.
I think that's really important to call out is that some of the magical technologies haven't changed too much. Using things in sympathy, things from your person or the target person, or clay and just all of those things, they kind of seem to always survive. But also the goal of the magician, which I laugh because I'm thinking about Wilmore's meme about the PGM where he retitles it how to shake down spirits and coerce people. So
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen that, but
Oh yeah.
yeah, that's a good meme, and it seems like we haven't changed a whole lot. Uh, so this brings me to kind of a conclusion here. So uh, this is kind of an interesting question, but I think it's important to have a conversation about. So, what are your thoughts on like the ethical considerations surrounding the practice of love magic?
As far as the ethics of using spells like this, I don't condone doing harmful magic, and I include coercive love spells in that category. Upon people who do not pose an actual threat to you. If they do pose a threat to you or to people you care about, by all means, have fun. But otherwise, I say use magic to improve yourself, and you'll probably be happier and improve your chances. But don't subject people to psychosomatic torture or try to steal their free will just because you can't get a date.
Yeah, I think that's very on point with what I was kind of trying to discuss with this topic because, um, like Jake always said, magic is amoral, and it's kind of up to the magician to determine what they do with it and how they feel about it. So I have seen people on both sides of where they do consider practicing it and where they don't. And so, as interesting as it is to call that out, I tend to be more on your side. Unless that person's a threat or whatever, do magic to improve yourself, and you'll be more likely to find a date. Anyways,
Yeah.
so in review, what are some of the more important lessons that we can learn from studying the history of erotic magic, both ancient and in more recent times, like the papyri, but even now?
Yeah. Like what I was saying before. I think that for better and for worse, people have not changed a whole lot in the last 2,000 years. Um, Partly in that there seems to be this regrettable tendency for a lot of people, and when I say people, I'm often talking about men, uh, to feel that they are entitled to possess other people, that gods or the universe owes them something. Um, and I'm afraid I'm not sure whether recognizing this fact really presents any obvious solutions to it, other than, maybe giving us just kind of an object lesson to point to and say, do you really want to be like the guy doing the copper pin spell? He seems like kind of an ass. Uh,
Yeah, he does seem like kind of an ass. I think that is quite possibly the most perfect way that I could end this podcast is that people are not possessions. And I couldn't have said it better myself. So, do with this what you will, audience. But I really just want to thank you so much for being on the podcast today, Brian. You have always been really well spoken and kind and offered really insightful things to think about. So, before we go, do you have like any projects that you want to share or even like links or things that I can give people where they can find more from you and like kind of look forward to what else you do?
yes, I do have a number of things in the works that should be appearing relatively soon. Um, I've collaborated with Alexander Cummins on a translation and examination of an early modern German grimoire of, let's say, necromantic treasure hunting and ghost laying. It's titled The Black Raven, or Der Schwarze Rab in the original German. Um, I've also worked with Mat Hadfield on a translation of Cecco Diascoli's commentary on the Sphera Mundi of Johannes Sacrobosco, which amounts to call it a very demonological take on a medieval astronomy textbook. Um, and finally, I just by myself translated a short treatise by Giorgio Anselmi on astrological talismans. Uh, these are all at various stages of forthcoming, um, probably roughly in the order that I listed them. I don't have any exact dates, but they keep an eye out. Um, if you want to follow me anywhere to keep abreast of any new releases, I would recommend Blue Sky at this point. I'm at B Johnson Freelance on there, um, and I will be announcing these things loudly and repeatedly when I can.
I look forward to all of them. Pretty much anything that you or Al or Matt do together and separately is phenomenal. So I really appreciate your work. And yeah, we are kind of migrating to blue sky these days. So that is where I will find you, and I will make sure to leave all the links. So going to end on that note, but thank you so much for being here.
Thank you once again for having me.